This is a 1976 Kawasaki KM100. It's a pretty cool little two-stroke single-cylinder dirt bike, and as you can see, it's seen a lot of use in its lifetime. This bike has good bones and it's mostly complete, but I don't know when the last time it even ran was, and it needs a lot of work to get back into fighting condition. I'm going to give this bike the TLC it deserves, and hopefully we can keep it going for 10, 15, maybe even 20 more years. One thing to keep in mind is that this is a rescue and not a restoration, so at the end of this video, this bike isn't going to look like it just rolled off the showroom floor. The goal here is to do as much as we possibly can with this bike, both functionally and aesthetically, for as little money as possible. And with my spiel out of the way, it's time to start spinning wrenches. Hey, that's the name of the show! The immediate first problem I encountered was that the bike was stuck in gear, and it didn't have a shift lever. So I was able to use some vice grips to pop it into neutral, and that way I was able to roll it around the shop while I worked on it. I spent a calf-destroying amount of time trying to kick this bike to life, but it just didn't want to start. So it was time to look at the usual suspects: compression, timing, fuel, air, spark. I checked the compression and timing off camera and they were both fine, so the next thing to look at was spark, because no spark means no explosion, and no explosion means bike not gonna run. As you can see, there was a nice fat spark visible with the naked eye, so that wasn't our problem either. So with that other stuff ruled out, it was time to check air and fuel via the carburetor. This is something I always hope isn't the problem, but on a 50-year-old bike, it nearly always is. I pulled the carburetor off to give it a good cleaning, but it looked oddly clean already, to the point where I wasn't convinced that it was bad enough to stop the bike from running. I did find a bit of sediment at the bottom of the float bowls, but overall it wasn't full of the gross brown sludge that you might find in a lot of carburetors this old. Nevertheless, I still hosed it down with carb cleaner and reinstalled it on the bike. And after all that, I had absolutely no luck getting the bike to start. As you can see here, I'm holding my hand up to check if air is blowing out of the carburetor, because at this point I was suspicious that maybe I had a timing problem with my rotary valve. Now let's have a quick sidebar for a second. I spent like half an hour trying to figure out a way to explain how a rotary valve two-stroke works in a way that wasn't going to make everybody want to kill themselves. And in the end, I wasn't able to do it. It's impossible. If you're genuinely interested, there's plenty of people online who could explain it much better than I can, and I'll leave a link in the description. For everybody else who couldn't give less of a fuck, I'll just explain the implications on this project. Basically, if the rotary valve is misaligned for some reason, it could mean that the engine is incapable of sucking in air-fuel mixture, making it no more than an incredibly messy paperweight. So I yanked the engine out of the bike, which is incredibly easy on a bike like this, and I popped it on the bench, and I pulled it apart to the point where I was able to check if the rotary valve was doing what it was supposed to. And lo and behold, it worked completely perfectly, actually. The rotary valve was opening exactly when it was supposed to, and there was nothing wrong. The engine never even needed to come out of the bike, and I still had exactly no idea why the bike wouldn't run. And so, for lack of any better ideas, I decided to just put the engine back together, stick it back in the bike, and keep trying to start it until something interesting happened. And then something interesting happened. Pretty much immediately, the carburetor started leaking gas all over the floor of my garage. And while behaving in a completely non-OSHA approved way, I noticed something peculiar about this gas. It's not very flammable, like, at all. The gas from my jerry can lights up no problem, but the gas that was in the tank when I bought the bike doesn't light up at all. Knowing the gas was bad, I tried spraying some quick start directly into the cylinder, and I was able to get the bike to start up for a very brief moment. While this was a nice moment, I still wasn't able to get the bike started by spraying quick start directly into the intake, so ultimately this doesn't solve anything, aside from proving that at least this motor's not cursed. The bad gas theory was still a good lead, but before I could explore it any further, I needed to do something about my leaky carb. Turns out a reproduction is cheaper than a rebuild kit, so I bought a reproduction carb and slapped it on the bike. I then filled the tank with some gas that I knew was good, and spilled it everywhere, ruining the mint condition paintwork. And surprise, surprise, the new gas fixed absolutely nothing. The bike still would not start. And at this point, I became convinced that the only possible thing that could be stopping this bike from running was if it was horrifically flooded. So in a fit of sheer frustration, I cut the cameras, pulled the engine off the bike, flipped it upside down, and was vindicated when I dumped a ton of disgusting oily gas directly out of the cylinder. And that's if you could even call this gas. It's so inert, it might as well be fucking Heineken. And if the crankcase is full of Heineken, it's impossible for a two-stroke to suck in air. After draining all the disgusting sludge out of the crankcase, I was confident that this engine would finally be able to run. I put the engine back in the bike, sprayed some carb cleaner directly into the intake, and then this happened. And that was all the proof I needed that this bike was actually capable of running. At this point I was so sick of working on the engine that I decided I would perfect it later, and I immediately got to work tearing down this bike so I could actually do some work to it. This was easily the 5th time I had pulled the engine out of the bike. Honestly, I don't have too much to say about this. I'm disassembling a motorcycle. I'm loosening all the bolts, and then I'm pulling off whatever part those bolts are attached to. I'm just gonna montage this, and I will rejoin you once the bike is completely disassembled. Hey, you're still here. That seems like a poor use of your time. So now the bike is completely assembled, and it is dirty. This thing's got 50 years of gunk and grime on it. So I got to work scrubbing and spraying and doing generally everything I could to detach this dirt from this frame. I even took it to the car wash, where I didn't really have good luck cleaning it, and I also didn't really get any good footage, so why did I keep this in? Eventually I had the frame and swing arm nice and clean, so it was time to hit them with the restoration in a can. The Rust-Oleum Black. Only the good stuff. While I was at it, I gave the triples a coat too because they were pretty gross. Once everything was dry, I bolted the swing arm back to the frame and I installed the shocks, which cleaned up really well with only a good wipe down. Then it was time to deal with the front suspension. I greased the steering neck for probably the first time since MASH was on the air, and I reinstalled it on the frame. As you can see here, I accidentally painted over the VIN number, but I really doubt it's going to matter on this particular bike. Then I reinstalled the front forks, which, like the rear shocks, had cleaned up to my level of satisfaction with only a shop towel. I also took the liberty of changing the fork oil, and as you might expect, I spilled it all over my nice new paint. Next, it was time to do something about these wheels. Overall, they were in good condition, but they needed quite a bit of cleaning up, and also the brake drums were horribly rusty. I did the best I could with the spokes, but they were really too far gone to polish, though I was able to get a good shine out of the rims. The brake drums also cleaned up well with some brake cleaner and a plastic brush. And this is what I ended up with for the wheels, which is completely good enough for the application, and good enough is all we care about. I then reinstalled the brakes. The brake shoes were actually in good condition, and I didn't need to replace them. I just ended up adjusting the brakes later on because they were a little bit loose when I got them. And then it was wheel installation time. At this point, it's actually starting to look like a motorcycle again, and a pretty fresh one at that. From this point, the next step was all of the controls. The foot pegs got the same treatment as the frame and swing arm. They were disassembled, cleaned up, and hosed down with some Rust-Oleum black spray paint. Like most of the other chrome and aluminum parts, the handlebars didn't need too much work, and I was able to bring them back to life with just a bit of degreaser and a wipe down. At this point, it was time to turn my attention back towards the engine. Just because we saw it run for 5 seconds doesn't mean we're done working on it. Much like the frame, this thing is completely covered in gunk which needs to be cleaned off. This kind of gunk is usually a pretty surefire sign that the motor is leaking oil, so while we've got it up on the bench, we'll also pull the case apart and redo the seal. This motor really didn't clean up that nice, but once it was acceptable, I installed it back in the bike for the last time. Here's a fun problem. The oil tank for this bike has a big hole in it. It's about the size of a quarter, and given that the oil injection on this bike actually does work, we do need this tank to be able to hold oil. It doesn't look like anybody makes a reproduction tank for this bike, and I also didn't have any luck looking for a salvage part, so our best bet here is going to be to patch this hole. My patch methodology isn't particularly elegant. I cut a square of plastic out of an old oil bottle, and then I heated it so I could conform it to the shape of the tank, and then I just basically glued it to the tank with a bunch of RTV. I tested it with water and it didn't leak, so I was confident it also wouldn't leak oil. Now, if anyone out there is looking at this fix and thinking it's janky and stupid, you're absolutely right. Let's just move on quickly from this. The original exhaust for this bike was complete and in remarkably good shape, but like most other parts, it needed a bit of a refresher. I used a combination of steel wool and wire brushes to knock off all the surface rust and scale, and then I gave the whole thing a coat of high-temp black paint. I then reinstalled the electrical system, which on this bike isn't saying much, there's only about 4 wires. And then while I was in the area, I reinstalled everything back on the right side of the engine, which was the carburetor, this side cover, and the kickstart lever. This pool of disgusting brown liquid used to be nice clear kerosene, but I soaked the chain in it, and now it's disgusting. On the bright side though, the chain is relatively clean. I'm gonna reuse it because I'm a cheapskate. Before I could reinstall the chain, I also had to reinstall the front sprocket. I promise I will lubricate this chain later. And you can tell at this point we're getting close to being done because the air filter's even being installed. Now at this point the bike is pretty well sorted out mechanically, and it's time to worry about painting the bodywork. The nice thing about this bike is there's really only 2 pieces of bodywork, the gas tank and the rear fender. The front fender is plastic, so we're not going to worry about it. This bodywork had previously been given a very crappy coat of matte black spray paint, so I got to work on removing all of that and wire wheeling off the rust I found underneath. And then I gave it my own slightly better coat of spray paint, but this time in green. Now the spray paint I used for this is the Home Depot brand of spray paint because I thought this was the closest color I could find to Kawasaki green. Now unfortunately this color looks absolutely nothing like Kawasaki green, and also the Home Depot brand of spray paint sucks. It doesn't spray nice and it doesn't dry nice, and I would recommend never buying it. Unfortunately by the time I figured all this out, it was way too late to change it, so we're just gonna have to live with it. The original front fender was made of plastic, and it was way too far gone to be saved. I ordered this generic one-size-fits-all front fender from Fortnite that, funnily enough, actually is Kawasaki green, and I drilled it to fit the holes on my triple. Once I had it installed, it was clear that one size doesn't really fit all, and it was just a bit too big for this bike, so I decided to just cut it down on the bandsaw. This was probably a stupid idea, but it actually worked surprisingly well. Once I had it installed on the bike, I actually thought it looked pretty okay, given that it's a total Frankenstein job. And hey, I told you I was going to lube this chain. I then went ahead and reinstalled the left side engine cover, and I was also able to install a brand new generic shift lever, which fit this bike perfectly. One fun little oddity about this bike is that neutral's actually at the very bottom and not in between first and second like you'd typically expect. Once the paint on the body panels had dried, I gave it a bit of a wet sanding to remove the eggshell, and then I reinstalled these pieces on the bike. This is where you really start to notice how not good the color match is between the stuff I painted and the fender I ordered, but please just understand that this was an accident and not an intentional aesthetic decision. I'm not blind. Now, the original seat for this bike has been lost to time, and reproduction ones are insanely expensive and almost impossible to find, so this is a seat I made out of trash that I had lying around. If you want to see how I did that, there will be a link somewhere on the screen. I attached the seat to the bike with bungee cords, thinking that I would later find a more permanent solution, but I never actually did. The seat is still bungee corded to the bike to this day. And at this point, we're so close to actually firing this thing up and seeing if any of this stuff works. Keep in mind, so far, I've only gotten the engine to run for 2 seconds, and every other mechanical component is completely untested. With the fuel hooked up and turned on, there's nothing left to do but give it a kick. After all that work, it felt so good when the bike started up, literally first kick. It ran okay, but it did have a bit of a bogging problem under throttle. So what I'm doing here is I'm firing it back up, and I'm going to fiddle with the mixer screw until I get better throttle response from it. It sounded and felt like it was running very good to me towards the end, and at this point I could not resist taking it on a test drive to see what it could do. I am aware that when I sit on this bike, I do kind of look like a bear riding a tricycle. And this is the point where I'm content calling this bike rescued. It's obviously not perfect, but it's a hell of a lot better than it was when it showed up. This was a catch and release project from the beginning, so now it's time to send it on to the next owner, and hopefully it can live a long life, teaching kids about how awesome motorcycles are. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe or comment or do whatever thing it is that makes YouTube recommend my videos, and I will catch you next time.